Good evening, and welcome to He's Alive, 40 Days of Preaching, Teaching, and Prayer. Tonight, we are broadcasting from Spokane Valley, Washington, from the Spokane Valley SDA Church. And we really want to welcome you all that are here with us and welcome you all that are viewing us, whether it's through YouTube or Facebook. He's Alive is actually celebrating 25 years of broadcast. And what better way to celebrate than to revisit the meaning and purpose of ministry. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that we have been given ministry because we have received mercy. So we are so thankful for this opportunity to be able to share with you. We have speakers that are coming from all over the country that's sharing with us ministry, whether it's family ministry, children's ministry, marriage ministry, health ministry, women's ministry, men's ministry. So whatever it may be, we have speakers that are coming and sharing with us. How do we start ministry? What's the purpose of ministry? How do we serve? And what does that really mean for the last days now? As we've moved along, we are actually on day number 14 of our 40 days. And you have heard, as we've moved along, the word guardrails, guardrailsmedia.com. And I just want to spend just a moment sharing with you what that is. So Guardrails is really a social community that He's Alive TV is putting together because they want to have a place where laity can be trained in regards to ministry. So all of our evening programs are actually broadcast and banked there. And believe it or not, the speakers that are coming in, they are not actually touring around our beautiful Northwest, but they are spending time during the day in a classroom setting and recording programs that will actually go and be banked on guardrailsmedia.com. I want to remind you that as an individual or church, you can go to this website and register as an individual, register as a church community, and be able to go there and find resources that will help you in upbuilding your ministry, that will help you in giving you direction on what to do with ministry. And these are all coming from people that have worked in ministry for years and just have spent time developing and sharing with people how God has worked with them through their ministry. Just practical thoughts and ideas. So once again, remember Guardrails. You will hear it again. If you have questions, you can let us know on that site, and we would respond to that. I also want to remind you, in the middle of these 40 days, starting actually December 26th, through January 3rd, we are going to have a prayer focus. We are super excited about that time that we will spend with prayer focus. Bring it in the new year of 2019 focused on prayer. For that time span, we will have Randy Maxwell that will spend some time with us. We will also have Michael Smith from the Oklahoma Conference that will spend some time with us, just focusing and bringing in that new year on prayer. And so we are excited about that. And put that on your calendar and be reminded of this prayer focus that we're going to have for that time. Once again, we want to thank you so much for being here with us tonight, we pray that you are blessed as you learn more about ministry. Before we go on to our speaker, we are so privileged tonight to have Natalia Nesterik. She will bring us special music tonight, and we want to thank her for being here with us.
Of crimson, God wrote His love on a hillside so long, long ago. For you and for me, Jesus died, and love's greatest story was told. I love you, I love you. love with the same hand that suffered and bled, giving all that he had to give, a message so easily read. I love you. I love you. That's what Calvary said. I love you. I love you. I love you. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know, nothing but the blood of Jesus. I love you. I love you. That's what Calvary says. I love you. I love you. I love you. Written in
Thank you, Natalia. Last evening, we started a health emphasis on health ministries. We had, thankfully, Jim Brackett that came and spent some time with us, and we're thankful because he's back with us tonight. Jim has been conducting health ministries on reversing diseases for nearly 40 years across the United States and also venues overseas, and we've been blessed by that. They have authored, he and his wife, 3 whole food plant-based cookbooks, the latest 7 Secrets cookbooks, many of us are familiar with nearly 300,000 copies sold worldwide. Jim is a scientist who returned to graduate school to complete a master's degree in public health nutrition. His years as a science teacher makes his presentations on nutrition and getting well fascinating for all listeners. So we're so thankful that he's here. I want to remind you, he will be also here tomorrow evening, and we're just going to carry our health emphasis on through next week with Charmaine Vieira that will be here Tuesday and Wednesday evening, and starting on Thursday evening through Sunday, Rico Hill will be here. So we're excited about this emphasis on health ministries. Welcome, Jim Brackett.
Very much. Thank you very much. It's good to be with you this evening. Our topic is reversing diabetes, what it is and what it isn't. And there's a new field. Besides type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, there is something now the researchers are calling type 3 diabetes. It's not yet a medical term, but that's a name they're giving Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease is probably preventable just like type 2 diabetes is. In fact, Dr. John McDougall recently said in a lecture, 100% of type 2 diabetes is preventable and 100% is reversible. remarkable. This is a magazine that you're familiar with. Several years ago, 16 million people in America have type 2 diabetes. Today, we have to erase that and put 29 million people. In fact, today in the United States of America, nearly 100 million of us either have prediabetes or diabetes itself. And if you talk to any physician, if they're open with you, they will tell you that prediabetes is diabetes. Almost 1/3 of all Americans. It's an epidemic. It's a silent killer. People can have diabetes for several years, for 10 years perhaps, and not have any noticeable symptoms. But every tissue in their body is being destroyed during that time, slowly, and it's a real killer, as you may know. Today, 1 person in 14 has diabetes in this country. By 2050, 1 out of 4. Astonishing. This is the opinion from the International Diabetes Federation, a very well-respected group looking at our obesity rates and our rates of overweight. 9 people out of 10 that get type 2 diabetes are overweight. It's a very serious risk factor. Now, many years ago, we diagnosed diabetes, and by the way, whenever I say diabetes, if I don't say otherwise, I mean type 2, because that's by far the major. About 95% of the diabetes in this country is type 2. We used to diagnose that if somebody had a fasting blood sugar of 140 or more. About 25 years ago, that was changed. They moved the goal line to be 125, and so suddenly there were another 15 million people that had diabetes because the medical community, scientific community, realized that at much lower blood sugars, people were in danger. And at that time, they also introduced a new category called prediabetes. If people's fasting sugar was 110 or more, they were up until 125. They were considered to have prediabetes, which, as I said, every physician, if he's open with you, would tell you that is diabetes in terms of the effect on the body. Now, currently, actually, it's been about maybe 12 to 14 years ago, we started using a new measure, something called hemoglobin A1C. If I get a chance in the time we have, I'll try to describe more of that. But what this measure is, it gives you the average blood sugar for the last 2 to 3 months. And this is a very important issue because it is not the spike in a sugar or the drop in a sugar that's the issue. What is the average blood sugar? So hemoglobin A1C has become the gold standard. I spoke to a physician recently who said, I haven't used a glucose tolerance test for 10 years. It's another way that physicians would try to double check on the fasting sugars. So if the A1C, it's a percentage. If it's between 5.7% and 6.4%, we call that now prediabetes. And if it's 6.5 or higher, we say that person has diabetes. That's a percentage of all the hemoglobin. You might be interested in this. It has a sugar attached to it. I'll try to get to more of that, as I say, if I get a chance before our time is up. A small percentage of diabetes in this country is type 1. Most of it is type 2. I'll explain the differences briefly. Gestational diabetes, quite rare. But if a woman, while she's pregnant, starts showing high blood sugars, it takes a very small amount of activity, exercise if you like, and perhaps some changes in the diets, fairly easily treatable. But this woman is at more risk for type 2 diabetes later in her life. Then there's diabetes insipidus, quite rare. Damage to the pituitary almost always is the case from a tumor, perhaps the most likely thing. Very rare. It upsets chemistry so that the sugar gets out of control. Now, clear back in 1976, a very well-respected nutritionist, I don't know him personally, I've listened to him lecture several times in person, Jim Anderson and an associate took 20 men who had diabetes type 2, diabetes mellitus we sometimes call it. And believe it or not, they decided to see if a carbohydrate diet, high in carbohydrate, would make a difference. There was good anecdotal evidence for this, and so they tested it. And it was published in 79. The experiments were done in 77, 78. They were able to stop insulin therapy on 9 of those patients who were getting around 15 to 20 units of insulin each day. In other words, their blood sugar became normal, so they were able to stop using medication, putting them on a high carbohydrate diet. Now, this is rather strange because everybody in America knows that carbs are bad for you. It turns out it's a false idea, and I'll try to make it clear why that is as we go along here. And then in 2 patients who were using about twice as much insulin, needing that much, if you will, to get normal sugars, they were able to take them off, and they had normal blood sugar with this high carbohydrate diet. And notice how much their cholesterol, their serum cholesterol, dropped from over 200 to less than 150. I'd tell more stories about that if we had time. We've done many live-in programs with smokers, and we have seen the same kind of thing. Large cholesterol drops, actually in our case, just 6 days. Amazing stories. Now, there's a lot of places you can go in the United States to stay there for several weeks and get help to do these things. They're kind of pricey. I'm putting them on the screen in their descending order. And actually, my wife and I operate one of these programs in the Spokane area. You can come stay with us for 6 days, and we will teach you how to get well. Well, this is a picture of our place. The cottages you see in the photograph are where our guests stay, and the lodge is nearby where we have the classes and teach our people how to prepare healthy, or I should say healthful food. So what is it, and what is it not? This is a photograph, we call it a micro photograph, magnified perhaps 100,000 times, of a capillary. I think everybody in this room knows the big artery that comes out of the heart, the aorta, splits, divides, one goes up, one goes down, and immediately there are branches to feed all the cells in your body. And every time that branch branches, it's smaller than the main one, then another branch, and finally the arteries are so tiny you cannot see them with the naked eye. We even use a different word for them, but they are an artery. We call them an arteriole. Sounds like artery, pretty much. And finally, that little tiny artery suddenly bursts into 20, 30, 40, 50 little tiny pipes. I think you all know these are called capillaries. So tiny that a red blood cell cannot get through without folding itself in half and sort of pushing its way through, or being pushed through. Very tiny little capillaries. That's what you're seeing in this picture. If you can see where my arrow is, this is what we call the basement membrane of the capillary, a little thin membrane. Then there's a lining inside the capillary of a layer of cells making a lining. And then this white area is where the red blood cells squeeze through. And follow me carefully, when the average blood sugar is above normal, this basement membrane thickens. This is the same membrane thickened because of high average blood sugars. And what has happened to the space where the red blood cells flow? It has become diminished. And so what you have with diabetes, this person has diabetes, is a great reduction in circulation. And virtually every problem caused by diabetes is the result of poor circulation. What are the complications? Well, poor circulation, which causes the rest. Heart disease, the number one killer for people with diabetes. Stroke. Blindness, number one cause of blindness in adults is diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Well, the other diabetes can contribute to that as well. Amputations, can you believe this? in America, we amputate 253 legs every day because of diabetes. Incredible. And I'll tell you what, folks, 100% of those legs could be saved. Dr. Jim McCann and I, along with our wives, were in a country where we've been several times, I should say several. My wife and I have been there 11 times holding reversing diabetes seminars. It's the country of St. Lucia, which has the sad distinction of having the highest incidence of diabetes of any country in the world. Now, there's other countries that have close, but they happen to be the highest. We were there one day setting up for one of our reversing diabetes sessions, 6-day program, and we bumped into the women who were taking down their things. They'd been there all weekend at this conference center, and we'd chat, and they were asking what we were doing, and one of them, when they found out, said to Dr. McCann, "Well, tomorrow morning, my husband's going to have his foot amputated because of diabetes." And Dr. McCann asks her several questions, and he said, "I'm pretty sure we can save that foot. Why don't you come here tonight and come to our first class, and let's see what we can do." And sure enough, before the week was over, the wound was healing. And the man today, years later, still driving his truck all over St. Lucia with both his feet. 253 a day in this country. Incredible. Number one cause of kidney failure in America is diabetes. Premature death. Peripheral neuropathy. Now, I was a guest lecturer with about 30 physicians for 15 years. We did a 3-day reversing diabetes seminar somewhere in this country every month for 15 years. And we would always ask at the opening, how many of you are suffering from neuropathy? And the reason we call it peripheral neuropathy is because the circulation out there at the periphery, like my feet and my lower legs, is far enough from the heart that if the circulation is compromised, then it's difficult for the body to get the blood back to the heart. So the nerves eventually stop working properly, and it first feels a little tingly, numbness maybe, and finally it starts to hurt. And it's amazing to me how many people with type 2 diabetes and peripheral neuropathy will use the same expression. They'll say, "It feels like I'm walking on razor blades." Pretty awful stuff if you really think about that. Peripheral neuropathy. And after just 3 days, in fact, it was only 48 hours, it was parts of 3 days, before they left, we said, "How many of you who have neuropathy found it to improve in just 48 hours?" And about 75% of the people already could see that it's improving. And some people will have almost complete improvement in a day or two. One time we were doing a class, my wife and I, with some physician friends in Santa Fe, about 25 people. They come on Monday, and we have them walking throughout the day at many different times. Not very fast if they can't, that's fine. We feed them Monday night. We give them 3 meals on Tuesday. And now it's Wednesday morning. They're going to leave in the afternoon. But it's Wednesday morning before breakfast. We're sitting around the tables. The food is ready. And before we have the blessing and begin our breakfast, the host says, "How are we doing? How are you doing with your sugars?" And this Presbyterian minister stands up and he says, "I've had neuropathy for 10 years. For 10 years, I could not lay down and sleep." Now, it's strange, but sometimes when people lay down, it hurts worse than when they're standing. He says, "I have slept in a chair for 10 years. Last night, for the first time in 10 years, I laid down and slept with no pain, no neuropathy at all." Now, let me ask you, how many meals had he had? Monday night, 3 on Tuesday, and it's Wednesday morning before breakfast. How many meals has he had? 4 meals. And of course, he's been walking, and that's how quick sometimes the neuropathy disappears. Gastroparesis is neuropathy of the stomach. So the muscles that squeeze like this and the muscles that squeeze like this to help the stomach empty don't work well, and the food, it's difficult for them to empty the food from their stomach. Infections, cataracts, gangrene, hypertension, that's high blood pressure. Larger babies because the mother's sugar is so high. The babies grow too fast, and of course that's a premature birth, which has its problems. And ulcers, and I'll tell you what, folks, the list just goes on and on, what happens with type 2 diabetes. Now, type 1 diabetes, we're not going to take much time on this, just briefly touch on it. Used to be called childhood onset. Today, adults are getting type 1 diabetes because of their lifestyle. It used to be called insulin, it is called insulin dependent because we can't give people oral medication. They have to have insulin. Small percentage in the United States have type 1. And they just give themselves about the same amount of insulin that their body would make if it could. I think most of you probably know that the beta cells in the pancreas make the insulin that we need, and their beta cells have been destroyed. I'll tell you briefly why we think that is in a moment. So all we have to do with type 1 diabetes is supply the insulin that their bodies would make. That can be a little tricky depending on what they eat and when they eat it, but if they're careful, they can do quite well. Although the average person with type 1 diabetes has about a 10-year decreased lifespan because it's very difficult to make it exactly like your body would have made it. So they can have few complications if they're careful. We think the culprit, rather than being a viral infection, is cow's milk. The culprit in causing type 1 diabetes. This is what we think the scenario is. It's not been proved, but the data are pretty solid. So solid, I have some physician friends that just say categorically, it is cow's milk. But what happens is there's a slight genetic difference in some people in a certain gene, such that if that child got cow's milk because the mother chose not or could not nurse, and if that child was given formula with cow's milk, the cow's milk protein, which normally would not get into the baby's bloodstream. But God designed babies to have a permeable, if you will, we say gut, we mean the small intestine. And the immunoglobulins in mother's milk, which are proteins and would be denatured in the hydrochloric acid of the stomach, and so they wouldn't work, are covered with a layer of fat to protect them from the hydrochloric acid. And then when they arrive in the small intestine, which normally highly controls anything that gets into the blood. The organ of the small intestine is a remarkably powerful instrument. But in this case, it's designed to let these great big, they're not big like this, but microscopically you can't even see them, but they're big in comparison. These great big molecules, these protein molecules covered with fat, so they won't get ruined by the hydrochloric acid, get into the baby's bloodstream, and those proteins from that cow's milk become an antigen, is the word we use, and the body recognizes it as an antigen and makes antibodies to kill it, to destroy it, I should say. It's not living. The problem is, for some people, the receptors on the beta cells look about the same. You see, a receptor is a protein, and if somebody has a gene, in fact, what genes do, genes have the information for the body to make a protein. And the protein normally on the beta cells has a certain shape, but somebody with a genetic variation, it has a slightly different shape, and now it looks like cow's milk protein, enough so that the antibodies that the body of that little baby made to take care of those milk immunoglobulins identify that cell, that beta cell, and destroy it. And we think that's the cause of type 1 diabetes. Now, once called adult onset, and now it's no longer called that because children are getting it. My wife and I have worked extensively with the Navajo people, who 80% of their population gets diabetes in their lifetime. The Pima Indians, 90%. People of color the world over are at risk genetically for type 2 diabetes, although we tell them genetics loads the gun, but it's lifestyle that pulls the trigger. You won't necessarily get diabetes because of your genetic makeup. But in any case, we were holding a reversing diabetes program for the Navajo people, and a nurse came to me. They have clinics there that do nothing but take care of people with diabetes. This nurse came to me and said, I have a 5-year-old child with type 2 diabetes. I couldn't believe it. Nobody had ever heard of that before. Later on that week, another nurse came to me. She said, I have a 2.5-year-old I'm taking care of that has type 2 diabetes. And now we've seen it even younger than that. Today, in our public schools, the school nurses are distributing hypertensive medication, medication for diabetes to kids. It's really sad. And it's all because of the way we've chosen to live. Most of the diabetes is type 2, as I've said. And you cannot give enough insulin to control the blood sugar as time goes by. For reasons that I don't have time to get into that in much detail. And virtually all people with diabetes have complications. These are two completely different diseases. But the problem for the big one, type 2 diabetes, is that we get too many calories. And I'll show you what I mean by that, especially if they are from fat. Scientists have given high-fat diets to young medical students, and you can make them get diabetes in just a couple of weeks. You feed them the same number of calories of sugar, you cannot make them get diabetes. The reason for that is that fat has so many more calories per pound, if you will, than sugar. Everybody in America, I say that rather loosely, has the idea that sugar is causing diabetes. That's really not the case. It's the fat that we're eating that's really the big culprit. All right, let me show you why. Let me show you how this is. Let's take 3 ounces of these different foods here and show you how much the same weight has in calories. Bacon, about 500 calories. Potato chips or corn chips, even a little more. Potatoes themselves, just that much. And bread, that much, just barely over 130 calories. And broccoli. Now listen, folks, here's the problem. When people eat refined foods or animal products, they get too many calories. It's just as simple as that. All of the animal products are high in calories. And the plant products, unrefined plant products, with exception of 4 categories of plants, all these plants are low in calories. Now, the high-calorie plant categories, we need to eat them some, but they would be used moderately. So there's olives, avocados, nuts, and seeds. Those categories of plants are just about as high in calories as animal products are. But the animal products cause other problems as well. So we tell people, if you really want to be well, get away from these high-calorie animal sources or refined things like potato chips and come back and use these wonderful foods that God gave us from the Garden of Eden. This is a drawing of a cell. I'll show you with my arrow how the artist has cut the top off the cell, and he's made most of the cell transparent. And one thing he's emphasizing here is this little blue thing. Now, they're not blue. He's made them blue for clarity. This is the furnace. Now, that's a metaphor. This is the furnace where our fuel, the food we eat, is burned so we can have energy to talk, think, move. He's cut the top off of this one. He's cut the corner out of this one. Here's 1, 2, 3 of them he's shown that he's left alone. These things have a name. I don't like to give you all the crazy names, but this is where the calories are burned. I don't care what you do. By the way, almost 25% of the calories you consume are in order to run your brain. So it's quite a lot of energy that we need, and it all comes by burning the food we eat in these little furnaces, if you will. And their preferred food, what's the very best food you can give them? This will surprise you, I'm sure. It's sugar. You say, what? Sugar is the preferred food because, folks, it burns clean and gives lots of energy, but not this kind of sugar or this kind. I don't know if they're keeping up with me here, or this kind. What about this kind? Oh, this is wonderful sugar. What about this? Wonderful sugar. I think you know, folks, that starch, when our bodies digest it, is sugar. There's no difference in the sugar that you get from starch and the sugar that might be in a teaspoon somewhere. The difference is that when you eat the whole plant food, whether it's this potato or these green beans or this beautiful dish of fruit with raspberries and blueberries and cantaloupe and maybe I can't tell everything that's there, these things come besides the sugar or the starch, and in some cases it's just plain sugar. The starch is digested into sugar, but lots of the plants have just plain simple sugars in them. And if that sugar comes with all of the vitamins and the minerals and the phytochemicals and the fiber, it's perfect fuel. Perfect fuel. Strange how people get so mixed up in what they think is good for them and not. Here's another form of sugar. In this case is some nuts of some kind along with some dates and so forth. And here's another example of wonderful sugar. High starch is the best plan. Now this is a picture from our cookbook with a waffle with blueberries and ice cream. Now, we make that ice cream so it's healthful. Doesn't mean you can eat a lot of it, but and that waffle, I think most of you are aware of the fact that the waffle you normally get, I won't name the restaurants, or that you make at home, is made from white flour with some egg and oil in it, and it's a really pretty poor piece of food already. The waffle we make is mostly made from oats. We have a few other things in there, whole plant food, then the blueberries, and we make the ice cream out of cashew nuts and rice, and sometimes we add some coconut milk as well. So it's a high-carb, low-fat, low-protein diet. You know, people ask me, so where do you get your protein? This is the most amazing thing, how uninformed Americans are. We were in a restaurant one time, and a very sharp young man, a vet, just back from Iraq, serving there. When he found out we were asking if they had anything that was just plain plants, he said, where do you get your protein? I'd love to go into detail. We'll do this in another lecture. Americans get 10 times as much protein as they need. It's bad for them. It's bad for their bones. It's bad for their kidneys. If you eat plants, you get 4 times as much protein as you need if you ate nothing but plants. So it's a crazy question. And there are many people in this country, most of the people, I'm afraid, in this country, have no idea about this, but this is the case. You ask any expert. You get unrefined plants, you get more protein than you need. If you have these things along with it, which is the only way you can do that is to eat plants. So carbohydrate burns clean and powerful. Fat and protein burn dirty. There's some big words here I don't even want you to try to read, but it names the chemicals that come out of the smokestack, if you will, when you burn either protein or fat for energy, and it causes problems for us. Now, back to this cell. Here's a piece of sugar. Now, this is simplified. That's the proper shape, and that furnace needs that sugar to be able to produce energy. And the pancreas makes 2 chemicals. Everybody knows, I think, the pancreas makes insulin. Everybody knows the word insulin. It's made by the pancreas. And insulin is designed to keep the sugar from getting too high in the bloodstream. And another hormone, I won't even give you the name, I don't want to confuse you. Another hormone made by the pancreas keeps the sugar from getting too low. And those work perfectly if we treat our bodies correctly. But if we don't, then the body has a hard time. Now, insulin has a lot of jobs in our body. I'm not going to take time on them, but these are they. So the body has to make quite a bit of insulin in order to make all of these processes happen. And here's the interesting story. I've got a graph here. I'm going to show you that what I'm measuring vertically here is how much insulin on average your body's using every day. This would be 0. This would be more and more, and this is kind of the normal amount right here. And over a period of, say, 10 years, whoops, I got that wrong here. I got to go back to it. I apologize for that. I clicked the wrong button. Over a period of 10 years, this would be from here to here is roughly 10 years this happens. Because we're living poorly, our bodies have to start making more insulin to control the sugar. So instead of following this green line, now day by day this thing would fluctuate slightly, but on the average, here it is. Instead of following that line, our body is having to produce more and more sugar, insulin, in order to control the sugar. Nobody's measuring for this. Nobody knows it. But finally, maybe about 10 years of this kind of poor living, the pancreas fatigues. We think cells in the pancreas may even die because of the overwork. And the body can no longer follow a trajectory like this of insulin. And so the amount of insulin is not what the body is trying to do to control the sugar. And at this point, right around in here, if somebody went to the doctor's office and their sugar was checked, the doctor would say, "You have diabetes." And then the doctor would say, "And the problem is you have insulin resistance." Now, I hate this term. That's a little too strong. I don't like the term for two reasons. It really isn't insulin resistance. I'll show you exactly what it is in a moment. And the other thing I don't like about it is when the doctor says, "You have something," you figure, "Okay, I've got it, so too bad, and what kind of medicine can you give me?" But it turns out that insulin resistance, you can make it disappear in 2, 3, or 4 days, often. Sometimes a little longer, but you can make it go away. But the doctor is not aware of that, I'm sorry to say. They were not taught that in medical school. Don't blame the physicians. The fact that Americans either won't, there are some people to say, "I don't care, I want my neighbor." Our neighbor was dying of heart disease, and we told his wife, we could help him get well. And he said, "No, I want my meat." So they either won't, or they don't know how, and it's so different that, so don't blame the physician. The physicians would be taught this if people would actually do it. Now, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, pancreatic fatigue. The real problem, folks, is free fatty acids. So here's the problem. It's difficult to keep the blood sugar under control. Every tissue in the body is slowly being destroyed. But the good news is, if the type 2 diabetic is willing to change the lifestyle, change what they eat, how it's prepared, we teach people that, and get enough activity. I don't use the E word because it scares people. In 2 weeks, almost half the people are medication-free and normal sugar. And often we see that in just 6 days for a good percentage of people, amazingly enough. And almost everybody has complete relief from neuropathy. If you go out more than 2 weeks, as Dr. McDougall said, 100% of type 2 diabetes is reversible. What fabulous news that is. Now, too many calories. What does that mean? It has to do with what we call fatty acids. Now, here is a video clip, and before I play it, I want you to understand that up here is outside the cell, and down here is in the cell. This is what we call cell wall, these 2 layers of little balls with legs. And embedded in the cell wall are receptors of many kinds. And what we're illustrating here is the insulin receptor. I hope many of you have heard that term. And I'm going to play this video and start and stop it as you watch it. So let's see if I can get it going. And I can stop it. You can see that the cell membrane is being indicated there. And they're moving it so we can see inside a little better. And inside you see many little yellow dots. These are fatty acids. Normally, in the bloodstream of a healthy person, there's a few free fatty acids. That's a whole lecture behind that concept that maybe we'll get to do another time. But they end up in the cell, floating around right close to the surface, the inside surface, so that when an insulin molecule comes along, like this, and attaches to the receptor, the normal situation would be the receptor then, having capture this insulin molecule, sends a message inside the cell that says, make, I'm going to use a lay term, make sugar grabbers. So the cell starts manufacturing proteins that go up, stick out through the cell wall, and grab sugars and pull them in. That's the normal procedure. The problem is when people have the typical American diet and there are too many free fatty acids floating around like this signal, now this is a very simple diagram. This little ball represents a signal, a chemical signal coming from the insulin receptor into the cell. This signal is blocked by these free fatty acids. So the sugar builds up in the bloodstream instead of being moved into the cell where the sugar in the bloodstream would be less. You see, that's the idea. And if you put people on an unrefined plant-based diet, you can remove those free fatty acids in a day or 2 or 3. It's amazing how quickly the body will repair itself. Now they're showing you take those away, and the signal gets to its destination. This is an oversimplification, but it is essentially correct. And now this sugar grabber, you understand that's not the technical term for this. Want to know the technical term? A glucotranslocator. There's many of them we have found now, many different kinds. That is brought up to the surface of the cell, and it starts pulling the sugar out of the bloodstream inside the cell. And guess what happens to the amount of sugar in the blood? It becomes less, becomes normal. This is called insulin resistance. It's insanity. All they have to do is start eating wisely, and it goes away. And they get over their diabetes just like that. It's amazing. And all the damage stops. It's just incredible what can happen. We know it can. My wife and I have watched it over and over. The research is filled now with these results. So all you have to do is do some kind of activity, eat whole plant foods with no refined products. And the activity, you want to build up gradually. Walking is enough. You need to walk 4 miles a day. You can do it in pieces. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't even have to do it fast. That's good news. And the problem, of course, is too many calories. Let me show you how that happens. Let's take this ear of corn. Let's take all the carbohydrate, all the protein. We're going to remove all of this. Let's take out all the vitamins and minerals. Let's get rid of all the fiber. Let's take out all the phytochemicals. That's a whole lecture in itself. And what you have left, believe it or not, if you did this for 14 years, you get 1 tablespoon of oil. I'd like to suggest to you that God intended for you to get that tablespoon of oil when you eat 14 ears of corn. Got it? But what do? We throw everything away except that tablespoon of oil, and we pour it on our salad, and we believe it's good for us. It's actually bad for us. The Americans believe that olive oil is good for you. It's not true. It's just less bad than saturated fat. But they've heard that, so they pour it all over the place. They're worse off than they were before. Now, in that tablespoon of oil, you get 100 calories. And I'm going to show you something else here that, before I do, I should just say that if you just had a tablespoon of oil on your salad once a day, above the calories that you need to operate, you would gain 1 pound every month. How many pounds in a year? Just 1 tablespoon of oil a day. It's amazing, folks, what's happening to Americans. Now, this is a little bit of hemoglobin, a very simple diagram. Our body makes hemoglobin, and normally there's a chemical, I won't name it, whose initials are DPG. I think you know that hemoglobin is designed to pick up oxygen in the lungs, carry it to every part of the body. But when the body is building hemoglobin, by accident, once in a while, it puts sugar there. This is called glycation. Glycation. Gly, like glucose, you know. And so it turns out when something gets sugar attached to it, there are some problems with that. In this case, what we do is we use this to measure the average blood sugar. I'd like to spend more time on it, but I'll just tell you this. Measuring the amount of hemoglobin that has a sugar attached to it is what we call hemoglobin A1C. So if these numbers across the bottom are percentages of the hemoglobin that have a sugar attached. And what we find is that as long as the average blood sugar, and that's what we're measuring here, hemoglobin A1C is measuring the average blood sugar. As long as the average blood sugar is low, there's no damage. This particular graph shows damage to the eye, I should say, the retina. And this is no damage, and this is lots of damage. So you can see the red line isn't very far above the ground line there. So not much damage till you get to about, this is where we define pre-diabetes, 5.7, 5 up to 6.5. What has happened to the amount of damage taking place in the eye? It just increases greatly, doesn't it? So this is illustrating how dangerous it is to have a high blood sugar, and we measure that now. The hemoglobin A1C tells us the average blood sugar over the last several months, so we use that to diagnose it. Now, there was a time when our hemoglobin A1Cs were being measured, and Dr. McCann and I, we have worked together for 57 years, I think it is. We lost him recently, and he's a very careful guy, but he knew that I was more careful than he was. Of all the people in the room, all the customers that were there, and then they measured the staff, Jim had the lowest. I didn't get mine checked for reasons I won't get into right now, but when he saw me over in the corner hiding, he said, "Check Jim's." He knew that Neva and I were more careful than he and his wife are, and he said, "His will be lower than mine." I wasn't sure of that, but sure enough, it turned out that mine was clear down at 4.5 because we use plant products and get lots of activity. Now, there's a section here I want to close with on dementia and the disease challenge that is now called type 3 diabetes. There's a genetic risk. It's a small component. But there's this gene called ApoE. And the normal copy of that gene gives no additional risk. Some people have some mutations, believe it or not, which even give them less risk. But lots of people have some mutations on that gene that give more risk, and then mutations that even give more. So there's 4 common versions of this gene. It's the ApoE gene, and if you could get this tested today for under $100 if you wanted. We encourage people not to do it because this is only about 5% of the Alzheimer's disease risk. But if it's APO2, if it's that version, ApoE2, some reduction in risk for Alzheimer's. ApoE3, which is the gene that's really unaffected, no change in risk, but 4 appears to increase the risk. And if you get that gene from both mother and dad, then you get quite a significant increase in risk, but just one gene, about 5%. Now, early Alzheimer's risk is for people, the ApoE gene is not an issue there much. This is very few people get Alzheimer's in the age range, starting getting Alzheimer's in age range 30 to 60. But it is also a genetic issue as well. Now, activity is a big issue in preventing dementia. I'm not going to take time to discuss it in detail. This is the insulin resistance thing I was showing you a little bit ago, where the high level of insulin is bad for the brain. This is why they're calling it type 3 diabetes. And all during these years that people have what they call insulin resistance, they don't know it, and this is bad for their brain. Very interesting. Many, many Americans, probably a huge percentage of Americans, because of the way they're living, actually have insulin resistance. The doctor doesn't tell them they have insulin resistance until here, where the body can't keep up with the demand for insulin. So there are things that you can do. When you eat right, we think you could prevent most Alzheimer's disease by just eating right and being active. We do know that even using your brain helps prevent it. I'm not going to read these. You can perhaps look at them later. Head injury is an issue here. I think you know this. Even people who play soccer or football in other countries, they call it, they are telling them that just butting the ball with their head is an injury that increases the risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Head injury, particularly repeated concussions, an increased risk. Protect your head with helmets during sports and so forth. Eliminate tripping hazards at home and avoid sports and situations that might involve repeated injury to the head. And then social activities, believe it or not. If we engage with people, it turns out that it reduces the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So folks, listen to this. One last thing. I have about 4 minutes left. There's this enzyme called sirtuin, which wraps the DNA, your genes, wraps some certain portions of it around a protein, making those genes, listen carefully to this, unavailable. So the body cannot use those genes to make those proteins. And these sirtuins somehow have the intelligence, when there are genes that might cause problems, to, if you will, short-circuit the process and keep those genes from expressing themselves so that there might be dementia or some other problem. And there's a lot of story behind this. These sirtuins can be suppressed. These sirtuins are the enzymes that, if you will, protect the body from having those genes be used, which would express a protein that would cause dementia. And here's the amazing thing, folks. There are things we do that interrupt the activity of these sirtuins. And notice this. These are the highest influence in this problem. They're all animal products, and chicken, which Americans love, is the worst of all. But fried bacon, broiled hot dog, roasted chicken, pan-fried steak, oven-fried chicken breast, deep-fried chicken, and on it goes. These things, folks, are clearly implicated in the issue with dementia. So the answer is, let's use plant products. Let's use them unrefined. Let's take care of our bodies with good activity. Protect our heads from these problems that we discussed. Use your brain a lot. And all of these things, even others I've mentioned, have been shown to reduce or prevent the incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. I'll tell you, folks, is Alzheimer's disease something we would want to avoid? It surely is. So it's time to get well. God bless you. Let me ask God's blessing on your thinking and on your effort to take care of your body. Father in heaven, thank you for your plan. That we could be well. Thank you for blessing our efforts when we make them. Thank you for your mercy. You forgive us, Lord, when we make mistakes. Help us to be determined to take better care, or perhaps I should say the best care of our bodies, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, it was nice to have 2 people in the congregation this evening. Such a crowd as I've never seen.